Tabby Khan. I'm a Senior Director of Analytics here at Komodo. I'm a clinician by training and have been at Komodo for 6 years working across a variety of different things in the analytics space. And today we have a lot of really interesting panelists to chat with you with a variety of different backgrounds. So Angela, do you want to kick us off?
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Angie Nicholas. I'm a family physician by training. I'm a regional chief clinical officer for Jefferson Health in Philadelphia and also a board member for Fight Colorectal Cancer, which has been a partner of Komodo because of some data analytics tools that we've been using for a very long time.
Hi, my name is Parag More. I'm part of Quest Diagnostics. I lead a group called Healthcare Analytics Solutions, focusing on the life sciences and public health. The charter and the mission for our group is how we can use the diagnostic data and the biomarker information at scale, leverage analytics, and more importantly, our direct relationships with patients and provider to accelerate the clinical development. Pleasure to be here.
Hi folks, my name is Sri Vatsan, or most people call me Sri. I'm the CEO of Endpoint Clinical. We're a randomization and trial supply management company. Prior to that, I was the Chief Digital Officer at IQVIA and Head of Life Sciences at Cognizant. So very passionate about clinical and clinical development and bringing drugs to market.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much for your time today, and thank all of you for coming to listen to this very interesting panel. So today, as you're aware, we're covering clinical development, and let's start at the top of the funnel. So that begins with trial feasibility. Parag, how are you using real-world and diagnostic data along with AI to really improve patient identification and site feasibility before a trial even begins?
Yeah, I think we work a lot directly with sponsors and directly with sponsors and the academic research centers, directly as well as along with great partners like Komodo. I think what we typically believe in that we have a lot of information. We have almost 70 billion data points that we have made it fit for use and use advanced analytics. So when you're looking at the clinical development perspective, it starts with planning. So what we do is we typically mine the data, all the data points, match it with the inclusion-exclusion criteria, IE criteria for the clinical trials, and try to provide the layer of advanced analytics to make sure where the patients are, right? So that's where we provide the site feasibility score for each of the studies that we are working on. What has changed in recent times is that clearly it was more of the site driven. I think typically what we had seen before is that the sponsors or the research centers will go back to the same sites from a site feasibility that they have worked in the past. But because of our national scale, as well as the advancement in the AI and development, we are able to do it at scale, right? So instead of doing a project by project, IE criteria by IE criteria, we're just able to do that at scale. The second part is the last mile, which is the connection to the patient recruitment, which is a critical portion. I think we are fortunate to have the direct relationship with the patients and the providers, right? You can identify the best cohort and bootstrap and start activate the best site. But if you're not able to reach out to the physician and the patients directly and say that, hey, you could be a good match for the trial if you're interested. So we cross that last mile using our data. So using that real world data or diagnostic data. So even if it's not just a retrospective, not just what happened, but we are now in a position to predict just based on the biomarker shifts where the patients are going to be and recruit intelligently for those patients. So that's the kind of things that we do using the real world data for the trial.
Can I add a point to that? So from the clinical perspective, and I have the benefit of a family member who was enrolled in 6 clinical trials during his cancer treatment. So that part of it is really important because when patients are told that they are at the end of the standard of care treatment for, let's say, cancer, it's a really great example of where we use clinical trials heavily for those kinds of events. The doctor's like, have fun, go figure out your clinical trial. And so we have used tools to, so cancer advocacy groups are collecting data on what are the clinical trials appropriate. And then back in the day when I got involved, we literally had a spreadsheet that 15 of us passed around across the United States, and people started using our spreadsheet. And that's how we found out about clinical trials. And every 6 to 9 months, when the doctor said to my husband, this clinical trial didn't work, I then pulled the spreadsheet again, looked at all the new trials, filtered, sorted based on what I thought the biology was, and then handed them to the doctor and said, which one of these 20 do you think would be great? That's how we used to do clinical trials when you were a patient. So the fact that we can identify using the data and you're reaching out to the patient, that's a game changer from a clinical perspective.
Yeah, it's a really great example of how technology has evolved things. My first job out of college was a clinical research coordinator, and I used to go awkwardly stand in the corner of patient rooms and hope that the attending would notice me and ask their patients about the trial. So we've come a long way since those days. So in this journey, now we've used your technology to identify the right patients and consented them. Shri, how is digitization and AI enabling better protocol design and streamlining the activities that take place in a clinical trial? And what does that really look like in practice?
Yeah, no, as you can imagine, everything in the clinical trial starts with a protocol. And protocol has typically been authored as an art rather than a science. And there's been so many different variations to the protocol. People started to bring lots of efforts to create the digital protocol, which would be the right place to start, where you're designing it from a digital lens standpoint. But with that being said, today you have analog protocol, which is a huge PDF with over 200 plus pages, and there are efforts coming up with industry consortiums to build a digital protocol, which is the right place to be. Where we sit in the e-clinical continuum is, as Parag and Angela have identified the sites and given the patient and consented, now the work starts. We have to set up all the e-clinical systems, EDC for data collection, IRT or RTSM for randomization, ECOA if you're collecting patient diaries and patient information. All of these start to look to interpret the protocol and then discern what is exactly their study build activities in each of those platforms to build out those things out. And as we start to do that, that period between consented patient, you want to immediately start recruiting. The study build phase is sometimes 6-9 months, depending on how many tools and technologies you set. So as you're starting to accelerate clinical trials, the more faster you can build the studies, set up all these different systems. As soon as his consented patient comes through the door, we're ready to go because we have everything lined up and to start getting it. The critical impediment to all of that is digitization, because today, all of that, everybody would read a protocol, they interpret it differently, then they set up and they interpret what that should be into a particular system. And that introduces errors, that issues quality issues, and there are a lot of downstream work and impact because you didn't do it right the first time and you had high variability. So as one side goes into identifying the right sites, the right patient journey, and how you get them faster, the other side is how do you build the right infrastructure. And we're seeing a lot of use of AI in building that digitization process, starting with the digital protocol.
That's so fascinating. I feel like there's so many different spaces that AI can really begin to have impact. And I think everyone in this room is familiar with the space, and so many trials go unfilled. We don't find enough patients. And then even when we do, sometimes we don't have patients finish the study because of various institutional barriers. So it already seems like some of these solutions are addressing those issues head on and really making a difference for patient lives.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Just out of my own curiosity, have we started to develop tools to identify what patients are more likely or less likely to finish the trial? Because that's a really important part.
Yeah.
From the clinical perspective, you want to recruit the right patient. And sometimes people feel like it's the last-ditch effort, and so you throw a patient that you're like, oh, I don't know how that's going to work. But it's really important to do it from the front end.
So it's like with it's almost like an air traffic controller, and you have 3 or 4 markers to tell you patient engagement. One is, of course, in the randomization trials, if the patient is coming or not, because that's like the air traffic. That's what they should be doing. You have ECOA and other assessments which behaviorally tell if the patient is actually doing what they're supposed to do, are they following all of the protocols and stuff. And then you have the EDC, which then says, is your data collection going as fast as possible, including lab data coming in? Because Most of the time, actually, what happens in the EDC is the patient may say, hey, I've taken this medication, or I've gone to a lab, but you're not getting the lab results as fast as you can, and you have to match it together. Each of these are disparate points, and now you have the ability to bring all of these points together to answer your question, which is which patient is most likely to be in the trial till the end, and who can run off. And there are lots of behavioral dynamics going on. Sorry,
No,
go ahead,
okay.
Parth. Yeah.
I think the reason I got excited is that I think what we're doing, we're going through each one of our 110 million patients that we interacted with and really assigning them an engageability score in a clinical
Cool.
research.
Yeah.
And that's the power of AI and the scale that we are able to do. And why are we able to do that, right? It's not just about the clinical pre-qualification based on your biomarkers, based on your interaction, because remember, Quest is a consumer brand at the end of the day, right? Trusted consumer brand. So we have a lot of information about their interactability. We have consents. We can reach out to them. How many times are they seeing the labs, right? And how are they progressing? How are they interacting with our the MyQuest, the patient-facing app? Those are all factors that, and we have the socioeconomic information at the census level. So we are able to assign that, right? What we have seen, it's great to have. I think it works for chronic conditions more so than some of these rare diseases and oncology. But as you said, like rare disease and oncology, when the standards of care are running the course, we have, at that point, we are reaching out to their physicians. Because one of the research that we did was 6 out of 10 patients said that if their clinical trial is recommended by our physician, we would consider participating. So that's how we use the engageability, whether it's direct by patient or whether it's through the physician that they're seeing.
Fascinating.
And as you can imagine, there are 2 scores, right? One is a predictive score, which he gives on how likely are they to be in the trial, and then there is the real-time score on, based on their likely behavior, how close are they to the predicted score. And so you could get both parts of it. So you start with predictive scores to identify the right people, but then the engagement dynamics will then tell you, is the prediction as real as what is happening in real time or not. So you need both.
Yeah. And one thing that's very philosophical is so many populations have been underrepresented in clinical trials. I think this was in the news a lot during COVID. Like, is this a representative sample? And then traditionally, African American communities have been more hesitant for a variety of very valid reasons. Do we think that AI will help kind of address some of these gaps in care and inequity within the clinical trial space as well?
I think it goes back to patient recruitment. I think recruitment is going from what we call scatter and pray to much more targeted and stuff based on data from Quest and the data you collect from even Komodo and others, because you're not going in, let's spray and pray, but very narrowed and focused on it. And so there is definitely with AI more propensity to get to the niche population versus just saying I'll put Facebook ads in these communities and hope that somebody will come together. But with that said, there is a behavioral challenge, and we can't oversimplify. AI can solve it because it's lots of years of dynamic challenges on why communities don't participate. They've had very bad experiences. They've not been truthfully told what's going on. And so I think you got to work it in both ways. One is to go to the right place, but also you have to have the right community dialogue, because without that, you're not going to be able to make the conversion.
Right. Yeah, but I think now we know where the disparities are and can start to address those and really target those communities. You need to start at the ground level, at the community health worker level even, to talk about clinical trials and what that means and the science around it. And I think, but before, I think we just didn't have the tools to pay attention to it. And now we can look and see across the United States where the communities that are less likely to participate, match them up with the populations we're trying to find, and maybe do, again, targeted things we need to do.
Absolutely.
And most people would come in if their family practitioner actually recommends that, and therefore also making a community outreach to the family practitioners becomes a very critical part of the ecosystem, because
that relationship building aspect, both with providers and patients, is huge. And I mean, I think it's something I like to be cautiously optimistic about, and hopefully we can leverage technology to improve there. So Angie, pivoting to you, bringing in the health system perspective a bit more, how do these AI-driven decisions kind of show up at that site level? And tell me a little bit more about the clinical workflows and how AI can add value there.
I think what we're seeing really is a true acceleration in everything that's happening in healthcare, like from answering the phone and the way that we manage our patient volumes, to efficiency around operating rooms and the technology things. I saw an article the other day that a CEO of a very large health system basically said, radiologists, be gone. We'll use AI instead. And you can imagine the radiologist, American College of Radiology was very unhappy with that. But all of these technologies help to accelerate the healthcare and the healthcare process. I think, and I am a family doctor, I do practice clinically, and I'm using AI every day. I mean, I put my phone on the desk and I sit and talk to my patient. And at the end of the visit, I'll do a couple things and place some orders. But soon there'll be interaction that I won't even need to place those orders, because I'll say, we're going to order this, this, and this, and those orders will be ready to go for me to just press the button. That's true healthcare, and using the technology so that I can engage my patient. And interestingly, I was talking with our CMIO a couple of weeks ago. Since I've been using that technology, my patient experience scores have been at the 100% level, literally every month since then. I'd like to think I was pretty good, but now I'm fantastic apparently, because literally I'm doing nothing other than talking to the patient and their family, which before I was typing, because notes are hard and you don't want to forget important pieces of the conversation. Where we're seeing the acceleration of AI is around the robotics that we're using, because the robots are not just robots now. They're driven with technology behind it. We all fondly joke with the orthopedic surgeons that very soon they won't be doing the surgery. The robot will be doing the surgery. The robots are much better, at this. They have templates. They understand. They need guidance, but when you have a template and you're cutting off the edge of the end of someone's femur to put a prosthesis in, put a hip to do a hip replacement, you really want the millimeter precision, guidance of the AI technology, as opposed to, hey, that looks pretty good, which is what they did in the old days. I'm not an orthopedic surgeon, but the brain mapping, the neurology brain mapping, the neurosurgery brain mapping guidance that we have to get down to the sub-centimeter to be able to touch an aneurysm and to do the things that we do up in the brain are pretty remarkable. And we couldn't do that before without the technology to guide and to lead, because again, it's sub-centimeter and you will render somebody paralyzed as opposed to attacking their brain tumor. So I think we're really seeing it everywhere. And the challenge that we have in healthcare is that the technology explodes, and to be super blunt about it, the cost explodes, and we will not be able to accelerate the technology until the cost starts to come down. Because healthcare in the United States, I'll give my little commercial, healthcare is challenging, and in many states is devastating. Hospitals are closing because they don't have the money to do this. So when we bought a NeuroNav equipment, $5 million, and that was like the tip of the iceberg. Oh, and don't forget about this, and you got to buy the car mats, and you got to buy the technology package, and all the other things. So it's fascinating to watch, and I think clinical trials are like the little 1% at the top of the pyramid, but that's what accelerates healthcare the most. And so understanding our patient populations, and I just did a quick little, hey Copilot, tell me about this patient population in this region of my communities that I focus on, because I need to understand why our lung cancer volumes are reportedly low, but shouldn't be in this community based on this data from American Cancer Society. And I dumped it all in, and 15 minutes later, I had a really nice analysis around where are the areas that I need to focus and what do I need to do to give to our lung navigators and our thoracic surgeons. That was just one little use case that probably touched every single thing that we're doing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what we all have in common, despite our very different backgrounds, is ultimately we want what's best for the patient. So I think seeing all these different ways that AI can be leveraged and technology in general can be leveraged is really powerful. Marmot is a great use for what you're talking about. It's making me excited. Maybe we can connect on that later. But yeah, so kind of we've talked a lot about different stages of the clinical development cycle, but once you have the right patients, the right sites, we've talked a little bit about execution, but what do we see as kind of, and this is for all the panelists, the biggest opportunities for AI to kind of streamline trial activation and day-to-day operations? We touched on it a little bit, Shri, with what you said, but would love to hear if anyone else has some thoughts on that as well.
I think once the trial is started, right, I think there's a quote by Mike Tyson. I think everybody has a plan until they get punched in their mouth. Right? I think it's Mike Tyson. I don't know.
It probably was. It sounds like Mike Tyson, doesn't it?
Right? I think that's the critical. I think this adapting dynamically as the plans are not going to go according to the plans, right? So understanding those signals early on, right? And engaging with the patients and the providers and the sites is going to be very, very, not very, easier than it was before, right? Because a lot of these things, what I observed was everything was after the fact, right? And so that's going to be a critical game changer once the patients are in their trial, right? So the second part is, I think it goes back to, Angie, what you said. I think if we bring all these productivity efficiencies, right, for the patient, the CRAs and the investigators, right, for the process and the operational aspects, they'll be able to spend more time with patients, right? Just freeing up that time, just as you said, right? I think instead of looking at the monitor, you're looking at the patient. Like, so turn your chair and just look. I think if that interaction increases, that through productivity improves, that time can be allocated to more patient interaction. That solves a lot of these challenges about the socioeconomic diversity and the representative population. I think it just has such a snowball of a ripple effect on so many different areas that I'm excited about, actually, and to contribute in that journey. So
100%.
Yeah, I'll take a little bit of a different, definitely, right? Productivity improvement is critical, getting more time with patients. But if you fundamentally look at in the clinical trial process, post consent, we spend a lot of time in data collection.
yes,
And data silos exist across the board. We all talk about site experience, but a poor site coordinator has 15 different systems to log in. If they do trials for 3 sponsors, that's 45 systems. They're having passwords in Post-its across the board and stuff. And the reason I start that is that when we start to really look at how do you make trials more efficient, you have to really look at the data flow on how you can make that patient journey and the site journey, and for us, supply journeys, as streamlined as possible. We have multiple handoffs, multiple systems where we recreate the same thing. We have queries which come in because the platforms are all disparate. So the way I was thinking of the efficiency plays in the following planes. The first is the data plane. How do you make the data flow happen as seamlessly as you can, right? And there are going to be areas where, in my system, you can only certain people can see blinded and unblinded data, and certain other systems it's de-anonymized data. But once we figure all of that out, just to make the data flow happen. For every data flow dollar, there is $6 of human workflow going on, because we use that data to make decisions. So we look at that and say, okay, I have to now visit a site because you're not recruiting fast enough, or you're not collecting data correctly, or I have to train it, or I have to call the lab and saying, hey, why are you backed up in your samples? You got to send me this. And that's what I call the human workflow. Before Gen AI and others, we started to automate a lot of the data workflow, and there's been lots of progress across the ages. Now is the era of automating the human workflow, where we're making all these decisions based on what humans do in that particular one. So should I visit your site in Jefferson, or should I visit another site? And I look at your data and interact with your personnel and say, no, Jefferson is great, they're recruiting well. Let me spend time in going after somebody else. Do I go and talk to Quest Diagnostics, or do I go and talk to LabCorp and say that? And then, yeah, so Quest, of course. And to say that's because the data is coming in, quality of service and stuff. So more and more that human workflow is starting to get automated. And so we're seeing a lot of potential for that in use cases like reading information, which are disparate. We are looking at places where we are making human decisioning with structured and unstructured information. So if you look at the human workflow today, yes, I see something in the system, but there's a human decisioning on how I would use that data to make that happen. So how do you bring in structured and unstructured information together to make better decisions and start to really work across automating the human workflow? So if you get the data workflow and the human workflow coming in an optimized way, then you can cut cycle times. But if you only tackle one versus the other, it's like a whack-a-mole. You solve this problem, but then the problem shows up in the other side. So,
yeah, absolutely. Anything to add from either of our other panelists?
Well, so I'm wondering if you're using AI to, I don't want to say shift recruitment, but really like target, say we need X of this population, realizing you don't have it, and then being able to stop in certain areas and recruit the right number, like really dynamically recruit, as opposed to you recruit and then you're done, and then you recruit and then you're done. I mean, is that another way that you're doing it?
Also what Parag said, to retain them in the process. So you need to do both. You gotta work the top of the funnel, but also make sure that you don't have attrition as they are in the funnel. And so again, you gotta be working both sides of it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What we've talked about a lot is just kind of using AI solutions to identify like, oh, recruitment is going poorly. Is it because we're being overly restrictive with criteria and just can't find the right patient? So it's really interesting to think about that human element as well and how that impacts all of this also. So I know we talked a little bit about like the data flow. Shri, from your perspective, Parag, how do you feel like Quest is improving data flow across systems? I know we've addressed a couple of these things, but if you'd like to go into more detail about that.
Yeah, I think we are investing and making a great progress in multiple areas. So I'll sort of split out, right? There is identified sort of PII identified use cases or the areas, and there are de-identified, right? So just starting from just to give you a little bit of a landscape on the labs ecosystem, right? Lab industry is significantly fragmented. A lot of the labs grow through acquisition. So the standardization of the terms and normalization, patient identity resolution, those are significant challenges. And this is extremely important for a healthcare services company such as Quest Diagnostics, because we don't want to deliver results from one person to the other person, right? So, and give it in the standardized. So one of the key things that we're investing in significantly, and it's actually investment has become more return-centric now because of the AI, is that how do we just resolve the patient identity with higher confidence score, right? How do we normalize, standardize the data on the identified level, right? So there's a lot of those. I mean, we are going at the source, at the LIS level, when the samples are getting dropped, right? Talking about the automation, a lot of our central labs are fully automated in this case. It's really living in some sort of a minority report when you walk into those labs, which is great, right? On the de-identified level, right? I think that's where, I think I'm going to link it back to the Marmot conversation, right? I think we talk about democratization of data, democratization of insights, right? But now we are in the era of democratization of expertise. I think tools like Marmot and the interactability that we are talking about is taken to the next level. Everybody is an expert now. They're able to do the job of the analyst, data analyst. So we're trying to upskill and try to train internally how to sort of embrace this sort of paradigm shift. So when you have a question about the data, don't go to the data scientist and data engineers, right? I mean, you can, but would you rather have sort of do this your initial hypothesis testing and see if there is a there there? I think we are trying to gain efficiency out of that, kind of on the de-identified level, right? So those are a couple of areas, but I think this advancement of technology, whatever our roadmap was 15, 20 months back, is completely shattered. I'm just going to be honest.
Yeah.
Right? So it's completely new roadmap, completely new way of doing a lot of these things for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I wanted to add a very key point Parag made, and not because a lot of people are looking at what are AI use cases and how do you build it out and how do we go down this journey, and you hit upon a very critical part where expertise. Today, work in the marketplace is done in terms of tasks. I show up, I have to recruit, I call 20 people, I get them. I show up, I have to do so many patient visits, so we are very task oriented. And expertise is also highly variable between a rookie who just comes in to learn the task to somebody who's an expert who can do that with their eyes closed. But that human variability is where there is an expertise curve. Where AI is trying to democratize is to really take that average up to the expert. And now your task is no longer about doing your expertise, but you're relying on our expertise as a companion to do much more critical work. Why am I not recruiting enough patients? Maybe because I'm the third trial with the same site, so I need to go to another site, or the PI is over-recruited on one versus the other. Now, when you go away from task to doing more critical thinking, you can then enable, and that enabler is AI. And so I wanted to just touch upon that key point you made, which is the thing about expertise, and how you think about democratizing expertise is a very critical part in optimizing the whole workflow.
And I think, one of the things that my leadership has been challenging me on is being more strategically thinking. And I was actually telling my young stepson the other day that, my boss gave me a project. He's like, when's it due? I'm like, tomorrow morning at 9. He's like, well, how does he expect you to do that? I said, because he expects me to use the tools I have. I needed to do an analysis, of the entire, Jefferson Health System and how we send patients in and out and where they go and what are the diagnoses. And he's like, that's unfathomable. I'm like, no, it's not. Watch. And I just took you upload the spreadsheet. That took longer than anything to get the stinking spreadsheet. Put it in the tool. It spits out you have to look at it. But being able to use, to work to the top of your license and use your critical thinking then to say, yeah, this makes sense, and now I can do this, and now what about this? And within an hour and a half, I had the entire analysis done, something that would have taken, I probably would have given it to somebody to write, to create the pivot tables and all of the things. Now I'm using my expertise, and it's almost like we're running. We're running faster and faster and faster now as we get all this data in to be able to spit out more. We wonder a little bit like how fast are we going to go, but I think it's going to be warp speed pretty soon.
Yeah, and I blogged about both parts of it. Is one part of that is when you get faster and faster, actually you start to put more and more work, and actually your productivity may come down because you're not putting critical thinking time to it. That's for another day. The other is you start to rely on these tools so much that it's called AI slop, where you're just like, that should be always right, and then you don't. You actually use your critical thinking and saying, oh my God, that just doesn't make sense. And so you have two ends to it for us to guard against.
Trust but verify, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. It's like, I think instead of running, we're sprinting at this point. But it's fascinating. Like another personal anecdote. I wrote my thesis on lung transplantation and racial disparities, and when we were testing Marmot, I ran the same question in Marmot, and I was like, great, this was 6 months of my life. This is why I have a master's in public health, but now this AI tool can do a pretty decent job in about 15 minutes. So, it's really cool how far we've come and how we can use this to help patients. I do want to allow enough time for audience questions, but before we jump into that, I think one question that I want to ask of all of our panelists. So if we continue to scale AI effectively, and I think to your point, every roadmap we've had needs to be thrown out and kind of built from scratch because there's so much new information within this space, we should dramatically reduce the time and cost of clinical trials. So what do you think clinical trial development, clinical trial execution looks like in 5 to 10 years if we do everything the way we want to.
Yeah. So I have a equation. Today we do 10 clinical trials and 1 or 2 are successful. So that's a 20% yield. The future is you're going to do 5 clinical trials and get 2 successful, and now your yield has gone up by 100%, and you're getting 4 out of 5, right? So that's the first part of it. How do you improve the yield? And there's a lot of work being done in the yield is to identify the right type of targets much upfront. And that's why you're seeing a lot of buzz in the AI discovery side, where before they had 100 targets to get to 10, which you'll then do the clinical trial to get to 2. Now you get from 100 to the 5 because you know that that has a high propensity to work. So that's one part of the yield curve, and we're going to see much more what is in the pike going to go down the pike faster, right? The second part of that yield curve is we now know that medicines don't work for everybody the same way. So before we would do a clinical trial and the CCO, not the CMO, would say, I need maximum number of patients who can have any indication so that I can go and label it and saying, hey, this can solve world peace and hunger. And we're realizing that that's actually not very effective, because then you find out that you're not the most effective for a particular cohort or a population. So the second part of it is, once you've identified the target, how do you then very quickly identify, to your thesis, the right racial characteristics for that particular cure and therapy so that you can quickly go and identify it. And that means it's not going to be less trials, but it's going to be much more targeted to those patient populations. The third part is good old-fashioned. It takes us 10 to 12 years to get through the clinical trial, which is a pure time-based. And that part, if it takes 10 years and 3,000 days to doing it, how do you get it to 2,000 and 1,500 days? And those go into automating the digital and the clinical workflow, right? So the answer is, yes, we're going to have much more faster speeds to it, but you have to attack the problem in all these 3 vectors. If you don't identify the right target, you don't get to the right patient population, it doesn't matter if you got it in 1,500 days, it's a wasted trial because the outcomes are not there. So aligning to the outcomes, which means I need to get good targeted therapy for the right patient in the market, and then attacking it through, do you have the right target with the right profile, with the right timeline, is kind of how I see that. So.
Absolutely.
I'll make a bold prediction. It may not come true, but it's bold, right? You know how we talk about 20% of our GDP domestically is on healthcare? In 5 to 10 years, I expect it, first time in the, history, to stay flat or go down. And it's going to be driven by the advancements that we do in developing new therapies, developing personalized therapies, and finding the right patients at the right time with the right mechanism. I truly, truly believe that, right? And the best sort of the lagging indicator is going to be what percent of a GDP are we spending on healthcare, and how much of that is actually being spent in interacting and curing patients as opposed to all the development and administration. So I really think that's going to happen, and it's going to start at the therapy development, clinical development.
I like it. Yeah, we're going to say, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I think, again, the clinical trial world is very unique, and it's a very small subset of our patient population and our clinicians in our environments. When I put my Fight Colorectal Cancer hat on, and I look at the patients across the United States that have been diagnosed with colon cancer, being able to say there are clinical trials out there, let's get your information. And I actually did this the other day. I had a friend's aunt diagnosed with colon cancer 3 years ago, got a treatment summary, all the protocols she was on, all of her CAT scans, put it all in and said, and give me clinical trials within 300 miles of where she lives that would be targeted therapy for her, and came up with 5. Again, it's like magic, in the clinical trial world, and that's going to be expected. And I think that opens up the world for everybody being able to participate in clinical trials, being able to go to the cancer center in Norfolk, Nebraska, which is literally in the middle of Nebraska. It takes 3 hours from any airport that you go to, and it's from where Johnny Carson was from, for those of you who remember Johnny Carson. But you know, they have this beautiful cancer center, and people travel there 3 hours to get there, and that's literally in the middle of nowhere. So you can imagine we're in the center of the world, and so, or center of the United States, and so being able to find patients from anywhere in our communities across the country is going to be really, really important as we really try to do those targeted therapies, because the targeted therapies are going to be unique and identifiable for each individual patient. And so when you have a X pill that targets, you know, if turned on, it does X, Y, and Z marker, but if turned to the left, it does these 3 markers, because I think that's what's going to happen, right? It's going to be a drug that you turn on and turn off different pieces of it to target different kinds of illnesses, cancers, markers, whatever it is. I just think the finding those patients are going to be the key to it. And the data that is available in Marmot and Quest and all of these, you know, places with the big data is going to be the key to that. And so I think it's the, you know, and in addition, those very low volume cancers have no clinical trials, because who's going to find the 3 patients in, you know, Nebraska? You know, it's just not going to happen. And so we're going to have a unique opportunity, I think, to target germ cell kind of treatments where they, you know, run through different kinds of cancers. I think that's going to be, and identifying those patients is going to be key to that. So I think it's just the world is going to change, I think, dramatically in the next 5 years with what we do, how we identify patients, how we find and think about the research using the data. Letting scientists think about what could be different, and modeling things is going to be really important. Modeling out the hypotheses that we have to get to the clinical trials, and then I think using the data then to identify the right patients at the right time that are going to stay in the trial and that are really truly clinically appropriate for the trials, so that they finish the trial, so that we have the data, and then the analysis just gets done, you know, much faster, probably by, you know, X times 5, and I think we're going to come out with treatments a lot faster.
Absolutely.
I love all this optimism, and what I've loved so much about this panel is how patient-centric it's been.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, I think you and I, as clinicians by background, like, you're always thinking about the patient
Right.
first, and this is a way where we've seen a massive leap in technology that's really going to get the treatments in the hands of the patients that really need them to survive. I have spent a lot of time talking, and I'd love to open the floor up to anyone who has questions for our phenomenal panelists today.